Okay, so there is a small literature that looks at the issue whether risk attitudes and preferences in general are constant over time, or whether if they're changing, they're only changing very slowly or marginally. Now, the small literature looks directly at the question of risk attitudes, whether they can be influenced by life events, by labor market changes in labor market states, or macroeconomic shocks. So there's Cohn et al. With Ernst Fehr, an experimental evidence showing that people in deep recessions are much more risk averse than people when they're confronted with a boom. For example, Sam looks at actually the issue whether life events, changes in labor market states, and macroeconomic shocks, whether all or some of these factors do influence the stability or the non-stability of risk attitudes over time. I mean, this is, of course, important because there's a large literature also that discusses risk attitudes or the impact of risk attitudes on the labor market. Geographical mobility paper by David with Thomas and Armin Falk and others, self-employment, occupational sorting, informal employment. There are lots of labor market outcomes that are impacted by risk attitudes. Now, we're not aware of a paper that has a comparative perspective regarding the potential time-varying nature of risk attitudes. We have two surveys which have actually identical questions on general and domain-specific risk attitudes, the GSUB and the ULMS. And an interesting point here is whether determinants of risk attitudes are stable over time across two countries that are very different. So we have a mature capitalist economy, and we have a laggard, as we heard yesterday, and a transition country. Okay, now we have data that span the recession, the Great Recession in both countries. However, Ukraine experienced a much larger shock than Germany. On the measure of harmonized unemployment, also the labor market trajectory are quite different in the two countries. So we want to see whether these differences in the intensity of the shock and differences in the labor market adjustment lead to differences in the stability of the risk attitudes, or whether at the heart are actually measurement issues. I will explain that in a minute. Okay, so here you can see this very clearly when you compare Germany and Ukraine, that you have much larger shock in 2009 in Ukraine than in Germany. Also, the labor market trajectory is very different. So unemployment goes up in Ukraine and stays up, goes a little bit down, but stays up, even though not at very high levels, while Germany is this miracle country as far as the labor market is concerned, that after a slight rise in unemployment, you have a secular decline until now, and close to 5% is the unemployment rate. So clearly, labor market trajectories are different. The shock is much larger in Ukraine. Okay. But before, let me talk about the data. I don't have a lot of time, so I'll do very brief. The German socioeconomic panel was started in '84, and East Germany was added in 1990. And as most of you probably know, it's a very known, large household panel survey with annual waves, and it has a lot of basically questions on attitudes, preferences, psychological IQ, and one can also link the information with parents, of children with parents. Okay, now the risk attitude question, which is identical in the ULMS, basically are risk questions on general risk-taking and domain-specific risk-taking. So this is basically self-assessed risk attitudes. Now, basically you have a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 means you're completely unwilling to take risks, while 10 means you're completely willing to take risks. Now, this self-assessed risk measure has been experimentally validated by Thomas, Dohmen, and Armin Falk and others. They basically took 450 subjects and basically asked, or did a lottery experiment where you basically can choose between a safe amount and winning with a 50% probability a larger sum. And so basically the switching point of the safe bet or of the safe amount can be compared with the answers to the general risk question. As you can see, it's very I mean, there's a great fit, basically, between the response to the general risk question and the average safe value at the switching point. So maybe you can tell me, because 25 minutes is a bit short, but anyway. So I don't want to get into this much, but basically, I mean, because the lottery question basically gives the same context to all respondents. So it's not that people basically view the world or states of the world in a different way. They all, I mean, the state of the world is the same in this experiment. So since you have this high correspondence between the responses and the outcomes of the experiment, this is taken as an indication that these responses are true responses to of people's risk attitudes, and not that that there's heterogeneity because they see the world differently, but because they do have different proclivities towards taking risk. There's additional evidence on the validity, which has to do with that basically more risk-loving people are willing to hold more stocks. They're more willing to select themselves into self-employment, into occupations that have a higher variance, etc. So there's a lot of evidence that links relatively risky endeavors to these risk attitudes. Okay, now the Ukrainian Longitudal Monitoring Survey was basically started by me, I should say, in 2003 with the help of lots of people, certainly the 2003 and 2004 wave. Olga Kupets was the main collaborator in developing the questionnaires. In 2007 and 2012 then, we actually added the risk module that was in the GSUB. So we have identical questions. We had, of course, some tests, pre-tests, and so on to adjust the questions a little bit to the Ukrainian context. Now, the great thing about the ULMS is that you can basically reconstruct a complete job history of people going back to the year of the Chernobyl disaster, essentially. And we have these risk measures in two waves, 2007, 2012. Okay, we have these sample sizes, we have lots of information, so I think it's arguably the most comprehensive questionnaire regarding labor market outcomes in any transition economy. We have subjective risk measures, these general and life domain specific, and we have also objective, so-called hypothetical investment questions and lotteries. Now, there's no experimental validation yet of these general risk questions in the ULMS case, but I think, well, we assume that they're probably as valid as they are in the German case. Okay, now let's look very briefly at risk attitudes in Germany and Ukraine. So this is the general risk question. And as you can see, Ukrainians tend to be much more risk averse than Germans. I mean, there are lots of issues in terms of focusing, heaping. So lots of people choose 5, not because they're necessarily in the middle of the scale, but they like to choose a midpoint. But abstracting from such subtleties, you can clearly see that the Ukrainian distribution is bimodal. We're actually not willing to take any risk. Has more mass than any other category. Gender differences. Women tend to be more risk averse. I mean, this is basically women versus men. So women are more in the lower categories than. This doesn't work. Okay, so women tend to are clearly more risk averse than men, and you can also see that actually. Ukrainian women tend to be also clearly more risk averse than German women. Another important determinant of risk attitudes is basically parents' education. So we distinguish between low and high education, where in Germany it means Abitur or Fachabitur or more. While in Ukraine it means incomplete university education or more. Okay? Anyway, you can clearly see, I mean, if you look at it long enough, and we don't have the time, but you can clearly see that as you go from low to high, you get a lot more mass in the upper part of the distribution. So basically, individuals with parents, where parents have high education, tend to be more risk-loving than individuals with low, where the parents have low education. Okay, let me skip this because we also have some regressions. So you can also see when you look at age and risk attitudes that older people tend to be more risk averse than so. The willingness to take risks diminishes with age, basically. And this is also true in Ukraine. The last sort of individual-specific determinant is height. And people who are taller tend to be more risk-loving than people who are short. Maybe because in high school they were able to get the they were able to get their way more than people who were short, and okay. So here we have a regression where we look at the first wave when actually the risk questions were added to the surveys, and you can see clearly that women tend to be less risk-loving, older people are less risk-loving, while people who are tall like to take more risks. Okay, and father's education, also mother's education, is not always significant in the Ukrainian case, but anyhow, so these arguably exogenous. I mean, female is exogenous, probably. Age, height, father's education, mother's education. These are arguably exogenous variables. We also add, when we add some more endogenous variables like household income, financial position, or household wealth in the German case, these first determinants always survive. Even if you add a battery of lots of determinants or covariates, these first 4 or 3 certainly factors always survive. So gender, age, height, and especially father's high education tend to be good and constant predictors of risk, the willingness to take risk. Okay, now we also look over time to see whether this is stable, and you can see, because in the German case we have lots of waves where we have the general risk question. So roughly these things survive quite well. In the Ukrainian case we only have two waves, and height is not significant in 2012, but father's high education is. So in general, one can say that these determinants certainly, I mean, there seems to be a very stable relationship between these factors and risk attitudes. So what time do I have? Oh God. Okay, so okay, so forget that. Now, how is time variation related to measurement problems? Actually, Dohmen et al. in an unpublished paper did an interesting retest. So they basically took 300 long-term respondents of the SERP and basically re-interviewed them and asked exactly the same question. Only 30% gave exactly the same number, and the correlation for the whole sample was 0.62. I mean, so what they did to see whether this is due to maybe some important events within these 5 weeks, so they restricted the sample to those who had no significant events occurring between the interviews. And again, the correlation was 0.615. So given this very short time span, so much of the imperfect correlation over time probably can be interpreted as measurement error. Now, if you look at, so this, let me only do this one graph here, but if you look at the German samples, you basically have a correlation between of the answers of the general risk question, and this is regressed, if you like, on the days between interviews, and you can see that basically it declines to more than 0.4, even 9 years. So there is a very small decline from this 0.6, which is after 5 weeks, to a bit above 0.4. So the rank ordering seems to be quite stable over time. Okay, now in the Ukrainian case, so let me only to make it comparable, we also look at for these two where we have basically surveys 2004, 2009, and 2006, 2011. Now, in the Ukrainian case, these correlations are much lower. They are between 3.5 and 0.35 and 0.2. And also, as you can see, there are lots of dots down here. So there are lots of people who really change their response, a lot. Okay. Now, of course, we want to know whether this is due to maybe change in income of the household or wealth. This is due to some life. God, I should have talked into the microphone. This is due to some life events, or it is due to labor market changes or changes of labor market status, or due to just a generally perceived large macroeconomic shock. And as you can see, basically the income variables are not really terribly significant. What is significant is in the Ukrainian case, for example, worsening health will make you a lot less risk-loving, more risk-averse, while in the German case, improving health, if your health improves, you will become more risk-loving. Now, what always is clear that once you become married, in this period, you become much more cautious than. And that goes, that's valid, if you like, at all times. Okay, now the labor market variables are not really that terribly significant. There is, however, that people moving from employment to unemployment actually seem to take more risks, and maybe you can construct stories where you can say that if you become unemployed, you will take more risks to get another job, maybe. But one has to do more work to really pin this down. That's it. No. Okay. Now, what is very striking, though, that the average risk attitude. Sorry, I hit your cheek instead of the numbers. So this constant is always significant and largely a large negative. So in the German case, we can do a fixed effects regression, where because we have lots of waves with a risk question, and if you look at the, let me just do that. Why doesn't this work now? Okay, if you look at the constant, you see that 2009 is particularly large, negative, and 2010. So what this seems to say, and that's the upshot of this, is that changes in labor market states, or in the person's labor market states, does not seem to have a large effect. What really has a large effect is the general macroeconomic shock that occurs. That makes people much more risk averse, and that's actually in line with the evidence by Cohen et al. And by also Guizzo and Zingales have done a paper where they also show that people in a slump tend to be much more risk averse than when they're confronted with a slump, tend to become much more risk averse than people. So what we haven't done yet, and what we still need to do, is then to essentially look at what effect does this overall fall in risk loving has on the labor market, actually. So will you get less self-employment? Will there be less setting up of new businesses and things like that? Because so it's not that individual changes change risk attitudes a lot, but it's that the big macro shock causes generally risk loving to fall a lot, and that has an impact then on the labor market, and that we still have to. I mean, we have started, but we still have to do that. Okay. So I think I'll stop here.
And the discussant is David Jaeger.
Yeah.
Presentation. It's okay, but I need them. Yeah. So I have to look back up.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's an interesting start to the paper. I think it will end up being a very, very nice paper in the end. Hartmut and his co-authors want to answer essentially three research questions as I see them. The first is, do risk attitudes vary between Germany and Ukraine? Are the correlates of risk attitudes different between the two countries? And then the last point, which he just discussed, which is were risk attitudes affected by the Great Recession or by the business cycle more generally? And so I want to talk about all three of these. I'll probably spend the most time on the last question, however. So the answer to the first question, I think, is that is, are risk attitudes different between Ukraine and Germany? I think the answer to that question is clearly yes, that Ukrainians tend to be less willing to take risks than Germans, who are themselves pretty risk averse. Certainly in comparison to Americans. But if you look at the distributions, and Hartmut showed some other evidence that the distributions of risk attitudes between Germans and Ukrainians tends to be somewhat different. So the second question, that is, are the determinants between the two countries of risk attitudes the same? I mean, he didn't really come down on one side or the other in his presentation. I think the answer to this question is maybe. In the sense that the signs of the coefficients when you regress risk attitudes on various characteristics of the individuals are the same. Women are more risk averse than men. Younger people tend to be less risk averse than older people. There's this interesting result about height, so I'll try to stand up as tall as possible. And then the relationship between family background or own family background with regard to education. Having highly educated parents means that you're more willing to take risks. Being more highly educated yourself means you're more likely to take risks as well. We know that. And all those things are fairly consistent between Germany and the Ukraine. The difference is more a matter of magnitude than sign, that Ukrainian women seem to be extremely risk averse in comparison to German women. Okay, so let me spend the most time talking about this last question, and that is, are risk attitudes affected by macroeconomic conditions and the Great Recession in particular? And so I think there's a storyline that they want to tell, that risk attitudes were, in fact, affected by macroeconomic conditions, and particularly the Great Recession, and that the evidence that they present for Germany therefore should allow one to generalize to the Ukraine, given the rough similarities between risk attitudes across Germany and Ukraine that they show in the first part of the paper. And here I think I'm going to take a little bit more of a critical attitude that risk attitudes are substantially affected by macroeconomic conditions. And so, So if you take the fixed effects coefficients on the individual years from the German regressions that Hartmut showed in Table 6, and you plot those against indicators of the macroeconomic conditions like the unemployment rate, and I'll talk about change in GDP in a second, this is what you get for the German case. Obviously, there are only two observations for Ukraine, so you can't do this exercise. And what you see is that there's a weakly positive relationship between the fixed effects and the unemployment rate. But it's this: if you run the regression with the scatter plot, of course, there are only 7 observations or 8 observations. It's not. I don't want to oversell my results here, but you don't find a significant relationship between the unemployment rate and risk attitudes. In fact, the relationship you find is positive. not negative. Hartmut and his co-authors place an awful lot of weight on this particular observation here and claim that that's all about the Great Recession. But to me, given that the unemployment in Germany was essentially falling during this period, it makes sense to look at the overall relationship. And I don't see a strong argument here for saying that the macroeconomic conditions have a big effect on risk attitudes. If we look at the change in per capita GDP from one year to the next, and then look at the measured risk attitudes in the final year of that change. So, for instance, risk attitudes are measured in 2004, so if we look at the change in real per capita GDP between 2003 and 2004, and we plot that, we do that for all the years in which they observe risk attitudes, you get a sort of stronger positive relationship here. But again, it's not statistically significant. It's on the margin of statistical significance. But if you do this without 2009, again, there's very few observations, but the relationship essentially goes away. So making an argument about the relationship between macroeconomic conditions and risk attitudes on the basis of essentially one observation, that is 2009, I think is a bit overplaying the results, in my opinion. We can do the same regression here with the relationship between risk attitudes and unemployment without 2009. That actually improves the relationship a little bit, but it's certainly not a strong relationship. Again, this is only 7 observations. That's really all we have when you're talking about the macroeconomy and these risk attitudes. Nevertheless, I don't see that there's a strong argument that the macroeconomy has a big effect on people's risk attitudes. So yeah, with the third question, I'm also not so sure about the answer here. The causal chain that they want to argue occurs is that the macroeconomy goes into recession. That affects people's risk attitudes, and therefore there's going to be some consequences for people's labor market choices. But I really am not sure that we can make this kind of causal argument. And it does seem to be assigning much too much influence to risk attitudes. There's all kinds of things that are going on in a recession that, other than the recession affecting people's risk attitudes, that you might think would also affect their labor market choices. And in fact, there's probably much more likely is that risk attitudes are jointly determined with other things that are going on in a recession. So. The last point I want to make is that it's not clear that this relationship between the macroeconomy, again, with Ukraine we have only 2 observations, so we can't really do this kind of analysis, but it's not clear to me that we would necessarily want to extrapolate from the evidence on Germany with regard to the macroeconomy and risk attitudes to Ukraine. Given the relatively weak evidence in Germany, I'm not sure I would necessarily want to extrapolate to a country with different institutions and other differences. So, still, I think there's a lot of very interesting descriptive analysis in the paper. I think the comparison between Ukraine and Germany is a worthwhile exercise. I'm just a little skeptical about the relationship between the macroeconomy and risk attitudes.
I'll talk here. Thanks very much, Devin. Thanks very much, Hartmut. I'm a macroeconomist. I'm not a labor economist, and we know in recessions the risk premium is always rising, and we always wonder why is that. And I'm very glad you try to go to the micro level data and try to understand the evolution of risk preferences. And I hope eventually we'll have a convergence of macroeconomics and microeconomics. I'm very glad you're working on this. Would you like to take a few minutes to respond to David?
Well, I mean, I'm very grateful for your laudatory comments regarding the first part of the paper, but as you point out, it's just a descriptive piece at the moment. And on the other hand, I think your criticism regarding the causal relationship between the Great Recession, risk attitudes, and labor market outcomes is certainly, certainly worthwhile thinking about. However, I think your our point, which since we haven't written it yet, so it wasn't very clear from the paper, but our point that Thomas and I we think in particular that when you have a large deep fall in GDP, people will on average become a lot more risk averse. This has been shown in these experimental studies by Fea and al. And by Guizo and Zingales, for example, with bankers on one hand and financial professionals in the case of Fea and Cohen and others. So basically what we're saying is that when you get this big shock, people become more risk averse. And the fixed effects regression show this. So you're saying this is essentially an outlier. But what we're saying is that this is the main. The year 2009 is a year when we have these big falls in GDP, and this big fall in GDP has an impact on how willing people are to take risks in general. And actually the fact that the unemployment rate in Germany doesn't go up a lot, but actually continuously declines, actually makes that point that it's that people start to panic, or they just become a lot more risk averse in general, independent of their own personal situation. But being more risk averse could have these impacts in the labor market. I agree that with the data we have, we probably cannot establish this causal chain. But your exercise, especially with the unemployment rate, I think misses the point. In the sense that we're saying you have this big fall in GDP, people will be less willing, in general, independent of their personal situation, less willing to take risks. This is what the regression, I think, shows. But I did send you the paper 2 days ago, and it's only a very rudimentary paper. So I think your critique was actually perfect in the sense that because this is the part where we have to. We haven't really started yet, and just thought a bit on the evidence of one data, if you like, on one data point. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Any questions, comments, Igor?
I know it's not exactly central to this paper, but it would be helpful to understand.
Igor.
Yeah. I know it's not exactly central to this paper, but it will be helpful in order to understand how transferable is data from Germany to Ukraine. Have you tried to test if there is any difference in risk attitudes between West Germany and East Germany, and what was happening to this difference over the last 10, 15, 20 years? More 10 years, because this was the time interval of study.
I have actually, to be honest, I'm the Ukrainian man, so to speak, in this paper. I'm not the German man, in the sense that Thomas Dohmen, if you look at his, publication list, you will see that he has done a lot of work together with Armin Falk and Uwe Sunde and others actually on using the G-sub. I don't think. I mean, there has been. I mean, they did some work of looking at occupational choice. Because in West Germany, where you have a mature market economy, occupational choice is probably much more endogenous than in East Germany at the beginning of the transition. But I'm not aware. I'm sure there has been done some comparison between East and West Germany, but it's not. I mean, you would.
I can answer that a little bit.
Yeah. Good.
So. Yeah, since I've done some work with these data. The East Germans, the distribution of risk attitudes between East and West Germans in 2004 and 2006, the periods when with which I'm most familiar, East Germans tend to be a little more risk-loving on average than the West Germans. Actually, there aren't huge differences, but the East Germans are actually less risk-averse than West Germans. So that's the one piece of evidence that I know I can.
And do you know if that difference leveled out by now, or?
That I don't know.
Well, we can check.
That I don't know. No.
I mean, we can check that. I mean, it's not. I can send you an email telling you what. No, but I get the point. But actually, if you look even at the Ukrainian data here, 2007, there is a small group of people who is at 10, which is much larger, 3 times as large in Ukraine than in Germany. So
that's true. I spotted that as well. Looking at that graph.
Yeah, there's a greater variance in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I have a question for both speakers. Thank you for such interesting presentation. I want to know about which of these results you received were more unpredictable, maybe unexpected for you, like researchers. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, the expectation was that labor market, changes of labor market status would be. Or let me put it this way: the first part of the paper, where you just look at the determinants, there's nothing surprising because it basically shows that. That risk attitudes have a relatively long gestation period. There are certain factors that are always significant throughout or over time in all contexts, like in the Ukrainian context and in the German context. So that's not surprising. No? Now, with the regressions of these changes. I mean, I don't think there's much literature that has actually looked at a statistically or nationally representative sample of 2 countries and looked at the changes in risk attitudes over time. So, but theoretically, you would think that. Changes in labor market status would have an impact on risk, on changes in risk attitude. So, going to unemployment, I probably would have thought it makes you maybe more risk averse rather than more risk loving. So that's one of the surprises, if you like. No, so. But it's actually, the results are rather disappointing that they're not very strong. Even in the German case, where you have a lot, I mean, in the Ukrainian case, the ULMS is always a problem that we didn't have enough money to have a larger, sample. I mean, it's nationally representative, but still, it's a relatively small sample. So when you do these changes and people change their labor market status, you might not have a lot of observation. So you have a problem there. But even in the German case, we don't have. We don't get, a lot of significant effects of these individual life events. I mean, what is the only one that really is always there is getting married. Makes you more risk averse. But.
Very interesting paper. Thanks, Hartmut. I had a question about if you could comment on the role of immigration at all, because one big difference between Ukraine and Germany is Ukraine, you had you've had much more emigration, and if we assume that emigrate. So if you assume immigrants are more risk-loving, and then just for perhaps future direction could be interesting would be to look at Ukrainian immigrants in Germany and to compare to see how are their risk preferences compared. I know you couldn't do that in the GSOP data probably, but if you could do some games, for example, it could be interesting, suggestive evidence.
Well, we haven't looked at, or we haven't, if you like, ignored the issue of emigration. But I mean, let's put it this way: we look at changes in risk attitudes of those who stay in the country, so to speak. I mean, David did a paper with Thomas and others on geographical mobility. Within Germany, basically going from east to West Germany, and they have found that there is, more risk-loving causes, I guess, more geographical mobility.
The people who migrate within Germany, the Germans who migrate within Germany tend to be more risk-loving. But the one piece of evidence in the SIP is that. Immigrants in general in Germany tend to be less risk-loving. They tend to be more risk-averse than native Germans, which seems to contradict the initial finding, but it depends on where people are coming from in the risk distribution in their home countries, right? As we see, there's big differences, say, between Germany and Ukraine. So if you took a random sample of Ukrainians and put them in Germany, it would look like the immigrants are more risk-averse than the native Germans. So this is why this kind of comparative research is really useful, because then we get to understand what the distribution of the risk attitudes in the home country looks like, and so looking at emigration or immigration would be useful.
Andrei Mel, Institute for Management Consultant. Now we have the huge transition in Ukraine. Did you plan, or do you plan do some research for in immigration in Ukraine? Because 2 million from the east part of Ukraine go in Ukraine and Russia. We have the huge moment now.
Well, no, I'm sure that's a very interesting research project. But if you give me the finances to do it,
we can talk about it, because German government helps Ukraine, the GIS program, etc. We can talk about it.
Anyway, so I think it's a very interesting. Of course, it's a crucial topic that one has to find resources for.
Talking about labor market choices, I'm wondering, is it worthwhile looking at the subnational level and looking at unemployment rates within or across Ukrainian regions, across German regions? I don't know whether data allow this, but in principle, this should be available, right? GDP data at the subnational level in both countries, and the same true for unemployment. Could that help to exploit variation within the country?
I don't know. I'm not convinced. I mean, first of all, so instead of I'm not sure. And instead of have a yearly dummies, you want to interact it with. I mean, you could only do this in the fixed effects regression, for example. I don't see how you would do how you could do this in the. I mean, you could condition on where people the region, sure, but maybe that's and to see and see. You can basically could interact. Sorry, you can interact some of these labor market or actually also these life event variables with. Regional dummies, and see whether if it should be possible, yeah. But whether this, I mean, there is large variation clearly in unemployment rates and so on. But
just going back to the paper that I wrote a few years ago. We didn't find any evidence that income variation in regions in Germany was related to people's migrating, for instance. So I don't know whether there's, unemployment rates, you might get something. But for a lot of things, there's not going to be so much variation within Germany, at least. Maybe in Ukraine, I don't know.
Ukraine is probably more.
Is probably more.
I thought Ukraine would be.
Yeah.
No, that's a very
Especially
good
because you have
point.
only 2 data points and you could kind
Sure.
of inflate your number of observations potentially even.
Good point. Thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you for the presentation. I have the question for both the speakers. In your research, you used a lot of regression analysis. Which type of regression did you expect to obtain, which you obtained, and how you explain this? Thank you. Which kind of regression? Maybe some kind of linear or polynomial regression relations between the data.
Sorry, we use interval regression because you have basically censored, if you like, it's like a Tobit, in a sense it's like a Tobit regression. But we also use OLS regressions, and we use probits, but one can also use ordered probit models. Since you have a rank, since you have rankings. So those are the 3 types of regressions you would use, especially if the determinants tend to be exogenous. You think that they're exogenous, like gender, height. They should be exogenous to risk taking. But so they're just very standard. These are very standard types of regressions, very simple standard types of regressions that we use. I mean, we do. In these pictures where I showed a line, there we use partial polynomial regression, fractional polynomial regression, because you assume that the relationship between the correlation of the answers and the days, or the distance between the interviews, is not necessarily linear. So this is the only sort of non-parametric kind of regression we do, but this is not the important part of the empirical. This is not the important empirical part of the paper.
All right, we're out of time. Thanks very much. Thank you, Hartmut. Thank you, Devin. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes in this room. Thank you.